The courtroom was buzzing with tension. Outside, the sun was just starting to crest over the horizon, casting a pale light through the windows. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The prosecution was about to call its first witnesses, and the room was packed with curious onlookers, reporters, and the families of those involved. Ivan Cook, a tall man with a beard and frizzled hair, stood at the witness stand. He identified himself as an antiques dealer and broker of gold and silver. Cook was here to testify about his longtime doctor, Dr. George Nichopoulos. He had a problem with sleep and wanted to keep his weight down. Since 1975, Nichopoulos had been prescribing him a cocktail of drugs, quaaludes to help him sleep, Preludin to keep his weight down, and Sopper whenever he felt like it. Cook was 6 feet tall and weighed only 145 pounds, a stark contrast to the robust health that most would expect from a man of his stature. Next up was Art Baldwin, a flamboyant topless nightclub owner who had turned informant. Baldwin had the same issues as Cook's sleeplessness and weight gain, and Nichopoulos had been giving him the same mix of uppers and downers. Both Cook and Baldwin praised Nichopoulos, calling him a fine doctor. But Baldwin's words to the press in the hallway were telling. "This is the biggest fiasco I've ever seen for the finest man I've ever known. It's called catering to the press." The parade of patients continued through the morning and into the afternoon. One by one, they took the stand, each with their own story of how Nichopoulos had prescribed them various drugs. Alan Fortes, a former member of Elvis Presley's entourage, was asked by Dr. Howard Foreman if he was abusing the medications. Fortes, who had been receiving large quantities of Quaalude, Placidil, and Escatrol, replied with a simple, "I'm still alive." The state then called its first expert witness, Dr. Raymond Harbison, a pharmacologist from Vanderbilt University. Harbison testified that prescribing Quaaludes and Escatrol together was not medically appropriate. He explained that these drugs were pharmacological antagonists and could create a dependence if used over long periods. When asked about the drugs prescribed to Elvis, Harbison described the narcotics as inappropriate unless you're treating a cancer causing severe pain. In a surprising turn of events, the state called Nichopoulos himself to the stand. The defense lawyer, Buddy Tommyson, was furious. He argued that Nichopoulos had the right not to testify against himself. The prosecution, led by Hayes Cooney, shot back that Nichopoulos could take the Fifth Amendment if he wanted to. Cooney added that the defense had already stated in their opening remarks that Nichopoulos would testify. The hearing officer, Mike Bramham, ruled that Nichopoulos would be required to take the witness stand, as the proceedings were not a criminal trial. The courtroom was electrified. Nichopoulos' testimony was an ear-opener. He admitted that his office records were not the best, especially since patients often dropped in without appointments and got drug refills that weren't noted on their charts. He claimed he always used his best medical judgment and tried to be compassionate about his patients' problems. Dr. Howard Foreman, the most vocal panelist, interjected, asking Nichopoulos if he thought it was appropriate to prescribe 3 Preludins a day to a woman who weighed only 97 pounds. Nichopoulos mumbled that the office was going through changes, and it was hard to get the charts up to date. He agreed that too many drugs were prescribed in some cases. The hearing delved into the cases of a group of patients who were particularly hard to monitor, including Ivan Cook and his twin brother Drew, Gail Clifton, Barry Underberg, and Barbara Kaplan. Each of these patients was receiving a mix of drugs for various issues, from insomnia to weight control. The room grew quiet as the prosecution asked Nichopoulos about Jerry Lee Lewis, the famous piano player who had been hospitalized for drug abuse multiple times. Nichopoulos admitted that he had continued to prescribe uppers and downers to Lewis, even though other drug rehabilitation psychiatrists had told him it was a lost cause. He also mentioned that some of his prescriptions for Lewis had been altered, increasing the number of doses. The atmosphere in the courtroom became even more intense when the discussion turned to Elvis Presley. Nichopoulos recalled the 1973 crisis, where Elvis was bloated from Demerol, steroids, and acupuncture treatments. He talked about the 1975 detoxification and the 1977 tour cancellation due to drug abuse. Nichopoulos admitted that many of the drugs listed in Elvis's name were for his entire entourage, and he often used placebos and diluted drugs to control Elvis's intake. The hearing officer, Mike Bramham, allowed the defense to call a few witnesses to support Nichopoulos. Shirley Dia, a former girlfriend of Elvis's road manager, and Sheila Kahn, the ex-wife of actor James Caan. Both testified that Elvis didn't use drugs for recreational purposes and that Dr. Nick had tried to control his intake. The defense then shifted its strategy, aiming to portray Nichopoulos as a victim of a national television conspiracy. Joe Dugman, who had brought the charges against Nichopoulos, was called to the stand. Dugman denied any conspiracy and said the board had acted independently. The defense called Edward M. Brecher, a science writer, to testify about the state of medical practice. Brecher argued that substances like cigarettes and alcohol were as harmful as Schedule II drugs, and suggested that providing addicts with drugs might be more beneficial than isolating them from medical care. Finally, the defense began calling Elvis's associates. Billy Smith, Elvis's closest cousin, talked about how Elvis would take any drugs he found, and how Tish Henley, the nurse, managed the drugs at Graceland. Smith also recalled helping Elvis dry his hair just hours before his death, describing him as alert and in good spirits. Al Strada, one of Elvis's valets, testified about substituting sterile water for injectable drugs and filling capsules with sweet and low to limit Elvis's intake. He also mentioned seeing many drug packages with Las Vegas postmarks. Tish Henley confirmed that she had been in charge of the drugs at Graceland since 1975, keeping them in an overnight bag under lock and key. She remembered sending a dilated tablet to Ginger Alden for menstrual cramps, and later sending 2 Valmids and a Placidil placebo to Elvis's aunt, Delta, when Elvis had trouble sleeping. The courtroom was filled with the weight of testimony, each word adding another layer to the complex story of Dr. George Nichopoulos and his patients. As the day wore on, the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows. The hearing was far from over, but the air was thick with the promise of more revelations to come. Dr. Walter K. Hoffman, a friend of Dr. Nichopoulos, tried to take the blame for the poor record keeping at the medical group. But Imogen Collie, who managed those records, showed charts and graphs to prove that less than 1% of Dr. Nichopoulos' patients received prescriptions for the strongest drugs. However, the prosecution pointed out that many prescriptions weren't recorded at all, making those charts and graphs useless. Dr. Lawrence Rubble, a doctor from Memphis, testified that he first treated Elvis in 1973. Elvis had been taking a lot of cortisone in Las Vegas, which caused problems with his colon and bladder. Elvis got better with treatment, but his continued drug use led to more digestive issues. Dr. Rubble remembered a time when Elvis told him he needed drugs to get excited for a show, and more drugs to relax afterward. Elvis was performing twice a night. Dr. Rubble told Elvis that if he needed drugs to perform, he should either stop performing in Las Vegas or they would stop treating him. Elvis agreed to cut down to 1 show a night. On the 5th day of the hearing, the state prosecutors wanted to figure out who could talk about Elvis's autopsy and what they could say. Hayes Cooney, the prosecutor, asked Chancellor D.J. Alessandratos to explain his court order that stopped anyone from Baptist Hospital from sharing medical details from Elvis's autopsy. Cooney wanted to call Dr. Eric Muirhead as a witness. Alessandratos said his order was clear, and anyone who broke it could be in big trouble. This worried Cooney and Mike Pleasance, ABC lawyer. They feared that without protection, the hospital wouldn't let Muirhead testify, leaving the defense with no way to challenge the autopsy findings. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner, took the stand to defend Dr. Nichopoulos. He said Elvis died suddenly and unexpectedly, and if drugs had killed him, he would have been found in a relaxed position. When Francisco started talking about the toxicology reports, Cooney objected, saying the drugs in Elvis's body were irrelevant. But E. Tommyson, the defense lawyer, argued that the toxicology evidence should be allowed to show why it wasn't the cause of death. Tommyson suggested using a newspaper article about the drug levels instead of the autopsy records. This led to a heated argument. Cooney said newspaper articles weren't good enough for medical testimony, and reminded everyone that Dr. Nichopoulos wasn't charged with murdering Elvis. Tommyson screamed back that Dr. Nichopoulos was charged with murder. Dr. John Burkhart, the president of the board, tried to calm everyone down and said the board wanted to hear all the facts. The hearing officer, Mike Bramham, agreed and said the board would accept testimony about the cause of death and drug levels. Francisco continued, saying there was no gradual loss of consciousness, and other experts agreed that no single drug in Elvis's system was at a lethal level. Joe Dugman, the prosecutor, didn't challenge this point. Instead, he asked Francisco if his opinion differed from the hospital pathologist's. Francisco avoided the question, saying he couldn't determine what the others found. Dugman pushed, asking if the opinions in the autopsy report were different from Francisco's. Francisco said he wasn't sure what opinions were in the report. Dr. Edgar Akin asked if Francisco changed his mind after seeing the list of drugs Dr. Nichopoulos prescribed. Francisco said no. The defense then called Dr. Brian Finkel, a toxicologist from Utah. Finkel was a wild card. He said he did some tests on Elvis's liver and kidney tissue, but only part of the toxicology work. Finkel had talked to Francisco about the case over the phone. The defense played a video of Finkel on the 2020 show, where he seemed to support the idea that the drugs in Elvis's body didn't cause his death. But when shown a press release with this statement, Finkel said he didn't remember saying it. He asked to see the toxicology report, but the defense lawyer said it was part of the autopsy and unavailable. Finkel's testimony was confusing. He said his tests mostly matched the bioscience reports, but couldn't find some substances. After Finkel left, the prosecutors went to the Chancery Court to try to get Muirhead to testify. Cooney argued that the defense had presented testimony about the cause of death and drug levels based on the autopsy. He needed Muirhead to rebut this. Alessandratos said Muirhead needed protection from lawsuits by the Presley estate. He suggested a secret testimony, but this didn't work because of Tennessee's open meetings law. The closing arguments were similar to the opening statements. Scanlon, the prosecutor, said Nichopoulos prescribed too many drugs in large quantities over a long time and in bad combinations. Crawford, the defense lawyer, described Nichopoulos as a sensitive and authentic doctor, not a pill pusher. He accused Joe Dugman of trying to punish Nichopoulos without a fair trial. The board voted not guilty on the first two charges of unprofessional conduct and gross incompetence. But on the third charge of overprescribing, they voted guilty on 10 counts, including Elvis's case. Buddy Tomason, the defense lawyer, was devastated. Dr. Charles Allen said the seriousness of the charges required punishment. Dr. Howard Foreman added that Nichopoulos was a good doctor but careless in some areas. His record-keeping was terrible, and prescribing strong drugs to patients who just walked in was unacceptable. The board decided on a 3-month suspension of Nichopoulos' license and 3 years of probation. Dr. John Burkhart, the board president, said he felt kindly toward light action. The vote was unanimous. After the hearing, Cole called Dr. Harold Sexton, deeply disappointed that the autopsy was still a secret. Sexton said he had to keep it confidential, but after he was gone, his obligation would end. He hinted that he might leave Cole something important in a plain brown envelope one day. 6 months after Dr. George Nichopoulos' medical license was suspended, a team of detectives began a massive investigation into his practices. The team, which included detectives from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Tennessee Bureau of Identification, and the Memphis and Shelby County Metro Narcotics Squad, visited 153 pharmacies in Memphis. They spent 1,090 man-hours going through 6,570,175 prescriptions. Larry Hutchinson Jr., the chief investigator for Attorney General Hugh Stanton Jr., coordinated the effort. The task of sorting through so many prescriptions was incredibly tough. The detectives learned they needed rubber finger and thumb protectors to prevent blisters and calluses. These protectors became Hutchinson's biggest expense, and he had to ask for more money to buy 500 more boxes. "Everybody used them but me," Hutchinson recalled with a laugh. "I'm Catholic." After months of hard work, the detectives believed their thorough investigation had paid off. They found new evidence that strengthened some cases involving Dr. Nichopoulos' patients. However, the case that stood out the most was the one involving Elvis Presley, who had been prescribed a large number of drugs by Dr. Nichopoulos. Hutchinson, a tall and heavy-set man with graying hair, felt the investigation was already 2 years behind schedule. He knew he needed to dive deep into Elvis's background to understand the situation better. He turned to his friend Jim Cole, a reporter for the Commercial Appeal, who had covered Elvis for the TV show 2020. Cole gave Hutchinson a list of key people who could provide insights into Elvis's drug problems, including Ginger Alden, David and Ricky Stanley, Marty Lacker, and John O'Grady. One of the most important witnesses turned out to be Sam Thompson, one of Elvis's bodyguards at the time of his death. Thompson had returned to the Shelby County Sheriff's Department and agreed to speak with Hutchinson and his team. On February 8, 1980, Thompson arrived at the Shelby County Administration Building for an interview. Thompson shared his experiences working for Elvis, describing the paramilitary-like structure of Elvis's entourage and how Elvis's drug use affected his behavior. Elvis's personality could change drastically in just a few hours, Thompson explained. He would be extremely excited and hopped up. Thompson also mentioned a black bag that Elvis always carried, filled with drugs. He and Dick Grob, the security chief, had even drawn up plans to smuggle Elvis's body back to Memphis if he died on a road trip, to prevent a drug-related scandal. Thompson believed that Elvis's drug use was tied to his fear of aging and his inability to accept it. Elvis was the king of rock and roll, but he was getting older, heavier, and grayer, Thompson said. He had a big ego, and losing his wife and daughter really hurt him psychologically. When asked about other members of Elvis's entourage, Thompson described Charlie Hodge, who relied heavily on alcohol and a drug called Placidil to help him sleep. David and Ricky Stanley were regular users of marijuana and quaaludes, often getting spaced out. Thompson and Grob sometimes staged fake police raids to scare them into discarding their drugs. Elvis would sometimes fly to other cities to get drugs if Dr. Nichopoulos refused to prescribe them. Thompson also mentioned that Elvis preferred to get his drugs through prescriptions, as it made him feel better about his addiction. Thompson revealed that Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, was considering selling Elvis's contract in 1977 because of the drug abuse and its impact on Elvis's performances. Parker blamed the doctors, especially Dr. Nichopoulos, for Elvis's drug problems. Hutchinson and his team found Thompson to be a reliable witness, and his insights were invaluable. Thompson promised to encourage his sister Linda to speak with the investigators, as she could provide more details about Elvis's drug issues. A few days later, Hutchinson received an unexpected call from B.J. Thomas, a singer and former friend of Elvis's. Thomas, who had overcome his own drug problems, offered to help with the investigation. This unexpected offer gave Hutchinson a new lead to explore in his quest to uncover the truth about Elvis's drug use and its impact on his life and death. Larry Hutchinson and Jewett Miller were on a mission. They were investigating Dr. George Nichopoulos, Elvis Presley's doctor, for his role in the star's drug addiction. A tip from a former drug addict and Elvis's friend led them to Dallas. The man, Thomas, promised to give them details about Dr. Nick's association with the music industry's drug scene. Intrigued, Hutchinson and Miller flew to Texas to meet him. In Dallas, Thomas told them that Memphis was known for being an easy place to get prescription drugs. He mentioned that Dr. Nick was known for being a soft touch, willing to prescribe drugs without much hesitation. But when Hutchinson and Miller pressed for names and specific instances, Thomas became vague. They needed solid evidence, not just rumors. The investigation was already tight on budget, and their boss, Hugh Stanton, was already questioning the costs. Another part of their strategy was to interview witnesses like Sam Thompson, who could provide valuable information. One cold morning in February 1980, Hutchinson and McGriff visited Graceland, Elvis's mansion, to serve a subpoena and collect evidence. They were greeted by Elvis's uncle, Vester Presley, who recognized Hutchinson and wished them luck. Parking their unmarked car, they noticed something strange, a handful of bright green and black Librium capsules scattered on the lawn. The sight was alarming, but their main focus was the stack of canceled checks Elvis had written to Dr. Nick. These checks, with Elvis's increasingly shaky signatures, would be crucial evidence in the case. One of the key witnesses on Hutchinson's list was James K. Collie, Jr., Elvis's former valet. Collie was known for being talkative and sometimes uncooperative. In a book about Elvis's bodyguards, Collie was described as Fetch Him Bill, a troublemaker who had been fired for stealing from Elvis. According to the book, Elvis and his bodyguards had chased Collie to the airport, where Elvis, pretending to be a federal agent, forced Collie off a plane and threatened him in the Nevada desert. The story was wild, but it was just one of many tales about Elvis's erratic behavior. When Hutchinson finally spoke to Collie, he was working as a salesman for a brewery in Memphis. Collie had a lot to say about Elvis's unusual habits. He recalled how Elvis would demand well-done hamburgers at 3 a.m. and transform hotel suites into dark, cold environments. Collie also mentioned the incontinence issues Elvis sometimes had, which required discreet cleanup. Hutchinson asked Collie about Elvis's health and his relationship with Dr. Nick. Collie said that Dr. Nick was known as Needle Nick within the entourage, but he didn't believe the doctor was syringe happy. He explained that Elvis's drug problems worsened over the years, with more frequent overdoses. Collie described how Elvis would sometimes be unresponsive, requiring the entourage to shake and slap him to revive him. Dr. Nick would often be called to help. Collie also named other doctors who regularly supplied Elvis with drugs, including Dr. Thomas Flash Newman, Dr. Elias Gainham, and Dr. Max Shapiro. He confirmed that the drugs were always intended for Elvis, and the needle marks on his body were a clear sign of his addiction. In 1973, Dr. Nick had reportedly told the entourage that Elvis was no longer just an addict, but a hard addict. Collie remembered a time when Elvis, mistaking a saccharin tablet for a drug, swallowed it believing it would get him high. Another close call happened in Palm Springs, where Elvis and a young date nearly overdosed on Hicodin, a powerful narcotic cough syrup. The bodyguards managed to revive Elvis, but the girl was barely breathing and needed immediate medical attention. These accounts provided Hutchinson and Miller with a deeper understanding of Elvis's struggles and the role of Dr. Nick in his addiction. The investigation was complex, but every piece of evidence brought them closer to the truth. The night was tense as the entourage gathered around, whispering and planning. They were worried about the young girl who had overdosed on a potent mix of drugs. The group, including Charlie Hodge, the bodyguards, and Collie, decided on a cover-up. They agreed that if the worst happened, Charlie Hodge would take the fall. Hodge, who was asleep at the time, would be blamed for getting the girl high. The other girls in the house who were there as dates were sworn to secrecy. Dick Grob, a sergeant with the Palm Springs Police Department, was asked to make sure no police investigation would take place. The girl was rushed to the hospital's intensive care unit. Her stomach was pumped, and she was given injections to counteract the effects of the cough syrup. For 17 long hours, she lay unconscious. At 7 p.m., she finally woke up. Sonny West, one of Elvis's loyal friends, visited her and was shocked to see her react like a wild animal, hissing at him. The doctor warned that she had suffered from oxygen deprivation, but miraculously, she seemed to recover without lasting damage. The girl and her mother were offered money to keep quiet, but they refused. The incident remained a secret until the bodyguards published a book just before Elvis's death. Elvis's reckless behavior wasn't limited to drugs. He was also dangerously careless with firearms. Collie remembered a time when a stoned Elvis shot out a chandelier in the penthouse of the Las Vegas Hilton. He was sitting at the breakfast table, holding a gold and black engraved pistol, when he fired the shot. Another time, while Linda Thompson was in the bathroom, Elvis shot a bullet through the wall, narrowly missing her. The bullet grazed a roll of toilet paper next to her knee and shattered a mirror. Linda was terrified, but Elvis seemed amused, telling her not to get excited. Despite Elvis's erratic behavior, Linda Thompson stayed with him. She was a stable and supportive presence in his life, and Collie was often puzzled by her loyalty. Linda had been Elvis's live-in companion for 4.5 years, and he had lavished her with expensive gifts, including over $1 million in jewelry. When Elvis was hospitalized for drug detoxification in 1973, Linda stayed by his side, even sleeping in the hospital room. The Memphis investigators, Larry Hutchinson and David McGriff, were tasked with interviewing key witnesses to uncover the truth about Elvis's drug use and death. They had to serve subpoenas to several people, including Dee Stanley, Vernon Presley's ex-wife, and Ginger Alden, Elvis's fiancée. When McGriff visited Dee, he was taken aback by her appearance. She was dressed provocatively, and McGriff couldn't help but notice her thick makeup and revealing outfit. Dee was eager to testify, seeing it as an opportunity to promote her book. Hutchinson's visit to Ginger Alden's home was equally challenging. Ginger was extremely dependent on her mother, turning to her for advice on every question. Hutchinson found her lack of independence and intelligence disheartening. The grand jury heard testimony from various witnesses, including Graceland's staff and close friends. They learned that Elvis's final dose of drugs was delivered by his aunt, Delta Me Biggs, around 8:30 a.m. on August 16, 1977. Aunt Delta was the last person to see Elvis alive, handing him the drugs in his bathroom. In March 1980, Hutchinson and McGriff traveled to Los Angeles to interview more witnesses. They stayed at a cheap hotel and faced numerous challenges, including the ubiquitous answering machines and agents. Their attempts to interview Dr. Max Shapiro and Priscilla Presley were unsuccessful, but they finally managed to arrange a meeting with Linda Thompson. She arrived early in the morning, dressed simply, and shared her experiences with Elvis. Linda described how she first noticed Elvis's heavy drug use in 1972, when he was often groggy and consumed about 15 to 20 pills a night, mostly sleeping pills and potent narcotics. Linda's testimony provided valuable insights into Elvis's drug habits and the toll they took on his life. Despite the challenges, the investigators continued their work, determined to uncover the truth. Linda Thompson often found herself in the middle of Elvis Presley's chaotic world, where drugs in excess were a constant presence. She had a unique perspective on the man behind the legend, and her experiences provided a stark contrast to the glamorous image Elvis projected to the world. Linda knew that Elvis's life was dominated by his struggle with insomnia and a deep-seated need for drugs, DRS. George Nichopoulos, Elias Gainem, and Thomas R. Flash Newman were the primary suppliers of these drugs, ensuring that Elvis always had a steady supply. Linda witnessed first, and how frequently Elvis would pass out with food in his mouth, choking and needing immediate attention. He would fall asleep in the middle of eating, and I would have to clean food out of his mouth and out of his throat and turn him on his side to make sure he was breathing, she recalled. On one particularly frightening occasion, Elvis had choked on food and was completely unresponsive. Linda had to call Dr. Newman, who rushed over and gave Elvis an injection to rouse him. Despite Newman's denial of ever treating Elvis for an overdose, Linda's account painted a different picture. Elvis's drug use was so severe that even during performances, he often seemed half awake, sometimes giggling uncontrollably or appearing hostile on stage. Linda, who came from a strict, no-nonsense background, found it increasingly difficult to tolerate Elvis's lifestyle. She had a deep-seated aversion to drugs and alcohol, which only grew stronger as she saw the toll they were taking on Elvis. Dr. Nick, one of Elvis's primary physicians, advised her, "You are perfectly straight. You don't even smoke hash, and you don't do any of the stuff. I think you should leave. I don't think you are ever going to change him." Elvis's closest brush with death occurred during a flight from Las Vegas to Memphis. He had taken drugs and suddenly collapsed, gasping for air. The pilot, Milo High, quickly dropped the altitude to help Elvis breathe, and an oxygen mask was placed over his face. Despite these efforts, Elvis still needed hospitalization when the plane landed in Memphis. Linda noted that Elvis always carried a stash of narcotics, even when he went to the hospital for detoxification. Elvis's drug use was not just a physical dependency, but a psychological one. Linda explained, "I think he thought he couldn't get up, couldn't go to bed, couldn't perform without medication. His drug habits also affected his behavior, making him more generous with gifts and sometimes erratic on stage." Linda was aware that Elvis received drugs from various sources, including Dr. Gainem in Las Vegas, who supplied him with amphetamine. She even helped Elvis inject himself with narcotics, usually in his hip, and sometimes assisted him when he needed it. Despite her efforts to care for him, Linda eventually realized that she could not change Elvis's path. She left him, unable to continue living in a world dominated by drugs and excess. Linda's departure left a void in Elvis's life, and many of his inner circle believed that her absence contributed to his final overdose. However, Linda maintained that she had done all she could. His doom was preordained as long as he continued to abuse drugs, she said. The investigation into Elvis's drug use and the role of his doctors, particularly Dr. Nichopoulos, revealed a complex and troubling story. Linda's testimony provided a critical insight into the man behind the icon, a man battling his own demons and ultimately unable to escape them. Elvis's performances weren't always smooth. Sometimes he would struggle to walk normally, swaying to keep his balance. This usually improved after about 20 to 30 minutes, but there were a few shows where he never got his rhythm back. Dr. Nichopoulos, Elvis's personal doctor, was always there to give him medication before and after each performance. According to Sonny West, Elvis's trusted friend, the medication routine was intense. He would get medication to get up for the show, after the show, when he left town, on the plane, and even before naps. This cycle was relentless. Elvis's weight also became a concern. In 1972, he went from his usual slim 170 to 175 pounds to a much heavier build. He had gained weight from eating too much junk food and taking too many sedatives. This was a shock to Elvis, and he tried standard diets, but they didn't work fast enough for him. So he decided to try a radical diet. He and some of his aides, including Sonny West, started a program that involved daily injections of urine from a pregnant woman and a calorie intake of no more than 500 calories a day. Despite finding the diet disgusting, Sonny managed to lose about 25 to 30 pounds. Even though Elvis continued to take drugs, the diet helped him lose some weight. However, it wasn't enough for him to feel confident about a live satellite television special in January 1973, which was to be broadcast to 25 countries around the world. Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's closest friends, had a long history with the singer. They met in the army and became close during their time in Germany. Joe, known as Diamond Joe, was a key figure in Elvis's inner circle and was well paid for his work. After Elvis's death, Joe started a limousine service and later became the road manager for the Bee Gees. When detectives Hutchinson and McGriff interviewed Joe, he was dressed casually and seemed unbothered by the hard times that other members of the Memphis Mafia were facing. Joe was initially arrogant, but became more respectful when he realized the detectives knew their stuff. The detectives were aware of Joe's involvement in the Presley Court's racquetball venture, which ended in a financial disaster. Joe blamed the real estate developer, Mike McMahon, for the losses, but conveniently forgot that Elvis had backed out of the deal without warning. The racquetball facility continued to be a problem for the Elvis Presley estate years later, with legal issues and unpaid debts. During the interview, Joe was asked about Elvis's drug use. He strongly denied that Elvis was ever addicted to drugs, despite evidence to the contrary. Joe claimed that Elvis could go without taking pills for up to 30 days, which he believed was proof that he wasn't addicted. However, when pressed, Joe admitted that Elvis would sometimes pass out and sleep, and there were concerns among the entourage about his drug use. Joe also mentioned that he had talked to Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, about the drug problem, but Vernon didn't take any action. Joe himself had quit a few times over arguments with Elvis, but always returned. Elvis's collapse in Baton Rouge in 1977 and his subsequent hospital admission were attributed to exhaustion, according to Joe. But the detectives were skeptical and pointed out that no celebrity would admit to a drug-related hospital stay. Joe agreed but added that there were attempts to get Elvis to reduce his drug intake. Charlie Hodge, another close friend of Elvis, was in a much worse state than Joe. He was living on unemployment and seemed nervous during the interview. Charlie had been with Elvis for a long time and lived at Graceland. Despite his loyalty, Charlie's account of Elvis's drug use was inconsistent. He denied seeing Elvis abuse drugs, but admitted that there was concern among the staff. Charlie also recalled an incident in Palm Springs, where Elvis's date nearly overdosed on cough syrup. Charlie was present when Dr. Nichopoulos told Vernon Presley that Elvis had died of bone cancer. This was a shocking claim, especially since Nichopoulos had not seen the autopsy until 1979, and the autopsy results showed no sign of cancer. Charlie claimed he had kept this information confidential, but the detectives were skeptical. They presented evidence that Charlie's business partner, Dick Grob, had used this information in a book. Charlie was unsure whether he had shared the information with Grob, or if Grob had discovered it independently. The conflicting stories and denials from Joe and Charlie highlighted the complex and often troubled relationship between Elvis and his closest friends. Despite their claims, it was clear that Elvis's drug use was a significant issue, and the people around him had varying degrees of awareness and involvement. The Memphis investigators had a lot to digest after their interviews. Charlie Hodge, one of Elvis's close friends, had shared his side of the story about the cancer rumor. He admitted telling Billy Smith, Elvis's cousin, but only to help him through his pain after Elvis's death. Charlie emphasized that it was shared in confidence, and he believed it was the right thing to do. Hutchinson and the team then met Jerry Schilling, a former bodyguard and friend of Elvis. Schilling was known for his sharp mind and soft-spoken nature. He had a deep understanding of Elvis's struggles with drug addiction. He recalled how Elvis's health declined in the last few years of his life, largely due to the drugs. Schilling remembered intercepting a drug shipment from Las Vegas and giving it to Dr. Nichopoulos to see if Elvis would mention it. When Elvis didn't, it became clear that he was hiding his drug use. Schilling believed Elvis was trying to get better, but was undermined by the constant temptations around him. Schilling also talked about the challenges within Elvis's entourage. He mentioned that Charlie Hodge had his own health issues and had been hospitalized for nervous breakdown. He also recalled taking Alan Fortas, another member of the entourage, to UCLA Medical Center for a sleeping pill overdose. Schilling saw how the pressures of fame and the constant touring took a toll on everyone, not just Elvis. The team's next interview was with Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's longtime manager. Parker was a complex figure, known for his charm and business acumen, but also for his questionable practices. Despite his reputation, he appeared polite and straightforward during the interview. Parker downplayed his personal relationship with Elvis, saying it was respectful but not close. He admitted to only a few phone calls and letters during Elvis's time in the service. Parker also remembered a visit from Elvis in 1974, when he looked unwell. Elvis confided in him about his drug use, but Parker chose not to intervene. He respected Elvis's independence, even when he saw the physical changes in his appearance. Parker's hands-off approach was consistent throughout their relationship, but it didn't stop the investigators from questioning his role in Elvis's life and career. The interviews with Schilling and Parker provided valuable insights into Elvis's last years and the people around him. Schilling's account emphasized the personal struggles and the genuine efforts to help, while Parker's version highlighted the business side and the distance he kept. Both perspectives painted a picture of a man who was deeply affected by fame and the pressures that came with it. As the investigation continued, the detectives realized that the story of Elvis's life was more complex than they had initially thought. It was a mix of love, loyalty, and the dark side of fame. The memories and accounts of those who knew him best helped to piece together a more complete and nuanced understanding of the king of rock and roll.